for this application. So let's open up the console here, give it some space, and let's start by testing that we can in fact not access the x variable. So we first need to reload this, of course. So our budget controller, right? So .x, and it's undefined, of course, because as we know from the outside we do not have access to the inner scope, and also using our add function does also not work. So remember, this is our private add function. So let's now prove that we cannot use it from the outside. So let's say budget controller dot add with 5, so 5 plus x, and it doesn't work because it's not a function. So this is what we expected. And if we now go ahead and use our public test method, so public test, and now use 5, then we have a result of 28. So let's see why that is. So we pass 5 here into the function, and then this 5 value is passed into the add function, and therefore the result will be 5 plus x, which is 23, which is then 28. So using the public test method, which is the one that we exposed to the public, actually works, while using the add methods or the x variable does not, because they are private. Okay, so how does this work actually? Let's analyze what happens here. So when the JavaScript runtime hits this line here, it gets executed, and this anonymous function is declared and immediately called or invoked because of this operator here. Then these variables here and functions are declared, right? And we return an object right here. And this object contains the method that we called public test. But it could of course be lots of methods, not just this one. So this object is what gets assigned to the budget variable after this function returns. So again, after all of this runs, the budget controller variable is simply an object containing the method called public test, right? Because that's what we returned from this function here. Okay? Now we saw in our example that this public test method here then uses this add and this x variable even after this function has already executed. So why does this work and why is it so powerful? And I'm sure that you can already guess why this works. And so yeah, this works thanks to the power of closures. So remember, because of closures, an inner function has always access to the variables and parameters of its outer function even after the outer function has returned. And that's what happens here. So the iffy, the immediately invoked function expression, returns immediately, and so it's effectively gone. But the public test function that we return here will always have access to the x variable and the add function, because a closure was created here. That's why we say that the public test method is public, because it was returned and now we can use it. But the x and add variables are private because they are in the closure, and therefore only the public test method can access them. So again, all of this works because of closures. So these functions and this x variable are in the closure, even after this iffy here has returned. So if you truly understood all the basics that we talked about before, then this pattern is actually quite simple, but still very powerful at the same time. And if you're not 100% sure that you fully understand this concept, then you can always review the lecture about closures. Alright, so the first module is created, and we now understand how the module pattern works. So let's create another module, which is the one that's going to take care of our user interface. And let's call that one the UI controller. So we talked about this module in the last lecture, right? So let's now create it. So user interface controller. So again, we write an iffy here, right? So an anonymous function wrapped in parentheses, which is then immediately executed or invoked. So here we will write some code later. And now we need our last module. Now the two modules that we created by now, they are completely independent modules. So there will not be any interaction between these two ever, because I want them to be as standalone, as independent as possible. So for example, imagine if you ever want to create a more complex budget app with a completely different user interface, you can take the budget controller module and then expand it and not think about the user interface at all. Because the user interface is separated from the data. They don't communicate at all. And that is called separation of concerns. And separation of concerns basically means that each part of the application should only be interested in doing one thing independently. So again, these two controllers don't know about each other. They are standalone. They don't even know that the other one exists. Now, we need some way to have these two connected, right? For example, we need a way to read data from the user interface and then add that data as a new expense in the budget controller. And that's why we create a third module, which is the app controller. And we also saw that one in the last lecture. So let's create that one as well. So controller simply. And now we already know how this works, right? Some space here, invoke the function, and that's it. Now, of course, modules can also receive arguments, because remember, they are just function expressions, and so we can pass arguments into them. And that's what we're going to do with this module. We'll pass the other two modules as argument to the controller, so that this controller knows about the other two and can connect them. So I will specify two parameters here. Budget controller, and I'm going to write it in a slightly different way, and I will explain why in a second, and the UI controller. So these are the parameters. And so now when we call this function, we can pass our arguments into the function, and we want our created budget controller, so this one here, be assigned to the budget controller, which is this one here. So inside of our function here, of our controller module, it will have a different name. And the same thing with the other controller. So UI controller, okay. So I could, of course, simply have used the original controller's name inside of the app controller. Or I could even not have passed anything into the module and simply have used the other controls in here in our function, because of course we have access to them because they are in the outer scope. Right, so I could simply use the, let's say, the budget controller like this in here. But that is not a good practice, because this would make the controller a little bit less independent. Because imagine that we would change the name of the module, then we would have to do this all over our code. We would have to change the name everywhere in here, right? But we don't want that. So this way, we don't have to do it. So in case we want to change the name of the budget controller to something else, we would just have to change it down here. And then inside of the module, it will always be called simply budget controller. So this controller now knows about the other two modules, and it can use their code. So let's now actually try this out. So we use our budget controller, and let's test the public test method and pass it again the value of 5 into it. Okay, so let's now test this. Then we store it in a variable, let's say z this time. And now, as you know, we don't have access from the outside to this variable, so we have to create another method simply to print this variable to the console. So we need to return an object once again, and I'm going to create another public method. So I'm just going to call it another public. So these names don't really matter, because all of this is just to show you how these modules work and how they interact with one another. So this is not going to receive any arguments. And now all we do is to console.log the z variable, okay? Because again, doing it like this is the only way that from the outside we can have access to z. So let's now test this. So controller, and now we use another public method. We call it, and nothing happens. And alright, I actually know why this happened, okay? And it's because in here we don't return this value, but we console log it. And that's also the reason why this 28 appeared here in the console, because again we did console log it right here instead of returning it. Okay, so we actually want to return this result of the add function so that it can get saved in the z variable. So let's now test this again. Alright, so this time we have nothing in the console so far, and now controller dot another public. And here we go, so 28. So we have already done a lot of stuff here. We wrote different modules, both with private and public methods and variables, and we also made them interact with one another. So really cool stuff and really important concept that we learned in this lecture. So what we just created is the bare bones structure, or let's say architecture, of our application. And it's a simple one actually, but it's perfectly enough for this relatively small application. And I hope that you see how important it is to follow a good architecture, and I'm sure that you will see it even more as we progress with the course. A lot of courses will only teach you the coding part, but not the structuring and architecture that are so fundamental for this kind of project. Alright, so let's now start filling our newly created modules with some actual code right in the next lecture. Welcome back to the project. And in this lecture, we're going to set up our first event listener to handle our input button. So the new things that you're going to learn in this lecture is how to set up event listeners specifically for key press events, and you will also learn what the event object is and how to use it. But let's start by cleaning up our code here, because I want to get rid of all of this, because this was just to show you how everything works. And up here as well. So let's delete this. So some code. And I'll give it some structure here. So this is the budget controller. Give it some more space here. The UI controller. And then finally, let's say the global app controller. All right. So I'm going to set up the event listener for the input button right here in our controller, because this is the central place where I want to decide, so where I want to control what happens upon each event and then delegate these tasks to the other controllers. Okay, and we already know how to set up event listeners, right? So we first select an element and then attach it the event listener. So we use the query selector method. So document.querySelector, and you remember that one, right? And now we need to know the class or the ID name of this button. So in order to do that, let's check out our HTML file. And then I will just try to grab the class name. So we see that down here we have the button. All right. So this is the class that is attached to this button. So I'm going to copy it. And actually we should probably take a closer look at all this markup structure, but I'm going to leave that for later, okay? So for now I'm just going to grab this class name here, but later we're going to look better at the structure of this HTML file so that we can better understand our user interface, okay? So let's move back here and paste it here. So the add button, and this, remember, is the class selector because it is a class. And since this is how we select with CSS, remember this is then the exact same way that we select using the query selector because it uses the same syntax as the CSS selectors. Okay, and now all we need to do is to use the add event listener method, right? And what we want is the click event and then the function that gets executed as soon as the user clicks on the button. All right. So just to test this, let's create a console.log here. So button was clicked. And let's check this out. So reload and clicking the button. All right. So button was clicked. So it works. The event handler is properly set up. All right. So this was just a test. Now, of course, we cannot yet write the code in here, but we can write what we want to happen here later. So we can basically create a to-do list in here, which is basically the to-do list that we did in the planning lecture. So as soon as someone hits the button, we first need to get the input data, right? So get the field input data. Okay, after that, we need to add the item to the budget controller. So here we're basically creating a recipe for what we're going to do next. Then we need to add the new item to the user interface as well. We need to calculate the budget and we also need to display the budget on the user interface. All right, let's create some space here. So this is what we're going to do as soon as someone hits the button, right? So we get the input data, we then add the item to the budget controller, to the user interface, and then we calculate these budgets and display them. So over the next lectures, we're going to focus on that. But for now, there's one more thing that we need to do, because we not only want all of this here to happen when someone hits the button, but also when someone hits the return key, so the enter key. So let's see this. So imagine that someone writes something in here, let's say project, then a value here, and then instead of hitting this button here, hits the return key. So in this case, we also want all of that to happen. We also want to get the input data, we want to add the item to the user interface and to the controller and all of that. So it should be the exact same thing. So not only the click event, but also a key press event. And this is something new, so we did never use the key press event. So let's now do that. So we need another event listener here. But now we're gonna do it in a slightly different way. We're not going to select anything. We will just add this event listener to the global document, okay? So just like this, document and then add event listener. And that's because this key press event doesn't happen on any specific element, but it happens on the global web page, so on the global document, anywhere in the document, right? Now there are actually more than one type of event that handles when someone presses a key. So let's look at the event reference that I have already open here. Okay, so this is the reference for all the JavaScript events or the DOM events. And you can find this on my resources page as well. But now I already have it here open. And so here we see the keyboard events, and there are actually 3. So key down is when we start pressing the key. So any key is pressed. Then the key press event is when the key is already in the pressed position, and then the key up event is after we release the key. So for us, there's no need to use the key down or key up events. We're simply going to use the more common key press event here, okay? And remember, This is when any key is pressed. Not just the enter or the return key, but this is for any key, right? So we'll need to talk about that in a second. But first, let's use the key press event here. So key press. And then again our function. Like this, okay. Now we actually only want to execute some code when the user hits the return key, right? Not just some random key on the keyboard. So how are we going to do that? And the key to this is that this function here that is passed into the event listener can receive an argument, which is the event argument. And this is something that we have not been up until this point. So we've been using this function here, this anonymous function in this case, all the time without any parameters. But now we're going to use it for the first time, and I'm going to call it event. And actually we can use any name for this that we want, and then use it in our event listener function. But I'm just going to go with event here. Another popular name that developers use is simply E, like this, but I'm going to go with event so that we are sure what this means. So this automatically gets passed into our event handler by the browser, and there's nothing we have to do. So we just need to specify it here, and then we can use it. And just to see what this event object actually is, let's start by logging it into the console. So console.log event. And remember, this is going to happen when we press any key, so not just the return key. So take a look at the console, and I'm going to hit a button now. All right, and here we have a keyword event. So this is simply an object, as we can see, with a lot of properties. And it has a prototype, so just for the sake of curiosity, let's take a look at that. So a keyword event is the prototype, and this one has also a prototype, which is an UI event. So this means that the keyword event is a UI, an user interface event. And this one is also a prototype, which is an event, and this one is also a prototype, the object. And that's it. So we know that the object is usually the last one in the prototype chain, right? So we can use all of this here with the keyword event, right? And you know that already because of the prototype chain. But right now, I want you to focus on something else, which is this key code property here. So here you see a key code and a number, and this number is what identifies the key that we pressed. So right now I pressed a key and the key code is 107, but a different key will have another one. So let me press now another key. So I'm going to press the space key now. Actually, it has to be here in the document. So I press the space button, and this time the key code is 32. And now I'm going to press the return key. Again, it has to be here. So the enter key, and now the key code is 13. So this key code here is what we're going to use to say that we only want something to happen when this key code was pressed. So in this case, that the enter key was pressed. And in case that you ever need the key code for another key, I have this cool reference here, which you can also find on the resources pages. And in here, if we hit some button here, then we have the key code. So again, the enter key is 13, the space is 32, and this happens on any other key here. Okay, so just a cool reference. So let's now go back and use this knowledge. Okay, so what we're going to do is, as you can probably guess, an if statement. So we're going to use the event and then the key code property. And we say that it should be 13. And if it's 13, so if it's the return key, then let's log to the console that enter was pressed. Now, some older browsers, they don't use this key code property here. They use another property called which. And so it's a good practice to use that as well. And so we're simply going to use an OR operator here and say event.which 13. So if the key code is 13 or the which property is 13, then this happens. So again, this is for more older browsers or other browsers that simply don't have this key code property. And in this case, we're also safe because then we have this part here. So let's now test this. So I'm refreshing and now I'm hitting some random keys here, as you can hear probably, and nothing happens in the console, right? And now I'm going to hit the enter key. Okay, enter was pressed. So this works. Now, what do we want to happen here? Because we don't want a console log, of course, but we want something to happen, which is, as you can guess, the exact same thing what we want to happen when someone hits the input button. So we could copy this code that we're later gonna write here and paste it here. But as you probably know, this doesn't make any sense at all, because that would completely disrespect the don't repeat yourself principle. So the solution is once again to write a custom function. So let's do that up here. And I'm going to call this one the control add item function. So var control add item. And I'm going to prepend this control here to this function name because there may be functions with similar names in the other controllers and I want to be able to distinguish them. So I'm already planning with that, okay? So a function which simply will do all of this here. So this is not real code, of course, but this will then be where we specify all of these actions. So now what we do in here is to simply call this function. So in case that someone hits the return key, we want to call the control add item function. And that's it. And now here the same thing. So I'm going to remove this from here. So we no longer want the anonymous function here, but we actually want to pass the control add item function in here. And we already did that before actually in our other project. So it doesn't have to be an anonymous function. We can simply pass a function that we have, a standalone function, pass it here into the add event listener method. And again, we're not going to call it here, so we don't need this call operator because this is a callback. And so the add event listener method will call it for us when needed, so when necessary, so when someone clicks the button. So just to finally test this, let's log something to the console here. Doesn't matter here, so it works. And alright. So I'm going to hit the space key, nothing happens, and now the return key. So it works. And now I'm going to hit this key here, sorry, this button here, and so it should appear again. And yes, here it is. So it works. Alright, so now we're all set up to start adding some code to our event listeners. So let's do that in the next lecture. In this lecture, we are going to read the income or expense data out of the user interface input fields, so that we can use it in our app later. So it only makes sense that in this lecture you're going to learn how to read data from different HTML input types. Okay, so here we are in the app controller, and the logic in this project will always be that in the controller is the place where we tell the other modules what to do. So we write methods in the UI controller and in the budget controller to get some data for us or to calculate something, and then in here in the controller we call these methods. So in this particular case that I want to get the input from the user interface, I'm going to write a method in the user interface controller and then call it here in the controller so that I can get this data and then use it further. For example, to pass it into the other controller so that it can then add the input data as a new expense or a new income to the data structure that we're going to create later. So let's now start by writing a method into the UI controller to get our input. So here in the UI controller, we're going to write a method or a function. Now, this is a function that we want to use in the other controller, right? So it cannot be a private function, right? So instead, it's going to be a public function or a public method. So it will have to be in the object that this function here, this iffy, will return. So again, and I'm sure that you remember this code here will execute immediately, and then the object that we return will be assigned to this UI controller here. And all the variables and the functions that we define in the function will stay in the closure even after this function returns. The object that's going to be returned from this will have access to these private methods or functions and variables. Alright, so let's write our method. So return, as we were saying, right? And we return this object. So let's say get input. So a function without any parameters. And now in here we read the data from the user interface. So what do we have in the UI? So we have the type here. So if it's an income or an expense, then we have the description and the value. So let's see that in the HTML file. And let's actually now take a deeper look at this file as I promised you before. So basically the UI is divided in two parts, which is the top part here, which is this one. All of this is the top part, and then all of this here is the bottom part, okay? So we have the top part, and in here we have, of course, the budget title, the month, which we're going to replace later. Then we have the budget value here. We have the budget value of the income only, and also of the expenses. So all of these are in the top part, and we're going to use all of these later on, right? And then we have the bottom here. And in here we have the add container, so which is basically our form, so where we have all our input. And then our inputs are the add type, which is for the income or expenses type. We have the add description and the add value, and the add button that we already used to set up the event handler. Okay, and then below that, the container. So basically all of this here, right? This part here of the user interface is the container, which is also divided in two parts. It has an income part on the left side and an expenses part on the right side. And each of this has, of course, a title, right? And then it has a list, so an income list, and down here an expenses list. Okay? So right now these are empty because all of the items are commented out here so that it's empty in the beginning. But this is how an item looks like. So this block of code here is an item, and we will take a closer look at this one once we start adding items to our user interface. So let's now concentrate on what we need for this step, which is this add type, add description, and add value. So value, description, and type. So we're gonna select all of them and retrieve their value. So let's start with the type. And we already did this in our other project, right? So the logic is always the same. We select something and then we do something with the selection. So document.querySelector, and then remember it was the class called add and type. And actually it has two underscores, I think, but let's just double check. Yes, so two underscores, which is a special notation. Okay, and then simply use the value property. Remember that one? So that's actually it. So with this, we read the value of the type. And since this is a select element in the HTML, it works a bit different. So in these normal input elements, like this one here, so like these, we simply get the value that's written here, right? But in the select element, which is this one here, what we get is these values that are specified. So if the first one is selected, what we get is inc, which stands for income. And if the second one with the minus is selected, then what we get is the exp, so expenses. So let's just annotate this here so that we don't forget it. So we'll be either inc or exp for expense. All right, and now the description. So document.querySelector, and this one is add description. And again we use the value. And now finally the value. So document query selector add value, and reading the property called value. All right. Okay, so now we have the three input values stored in these three variables. Now remember, the controller is going to call this method and it wants to receive back all of these values. So we have to return something here, right? So how do we return three values at the same time? The best solution for this is to simply return an object containing these three as properties. So instead of having three separate variables, we should simply return an object with three properties, which are these three. So let's do that. So I'm saying return an object. And so let me copy this in the inside. Now, of course, I need to change some stuff. So we don't need these var keywords. And it's not the equal operator. But this is how we define properties, right? Oh, and also these should be commas and not semicolons. Okay. So this is our method for returning all of the three inputs that we have in the user interface. So let's now call this method from our controller, and we're going to do it right here. So under this comment here, we will say var input should be the result of calling the getInput method. So, and it's a method of the UI controller, right? So UI controller, which is the module that we have access to, and then getInput, which is the public method that we can access. And no parameters here. So let's now console log simply the input. And we can remove this console log from down here. Okay. So remember, this will happen as soon as we either click the input button or hit the enter key, because this is in the function, right? So this is in a function that is called when either one of these actions happen, right? So let's now test this. And I'm going to refresh it. So let's say it's a minus, so an expense, and I'm just calling it test and some number. And now I hit enter and okay. So we have an object actually, and it has type expense. So this is correct because I chose the minus here. Then the description is test, right, which we have here, and the value is 23. So everything is correct. Let's just create another one. So test2 with something else, let's say 12. And now hitting the key, so it also works. So income and test2 and 12. Cool. So now we have these two modules talking to one another by calling each other's methods. So this is a pattern that we will see a lot of time happening. So basically the controller calling some method, and these methods then do something and return it. Now if we move up here to this method here and to this controller, there is actually one small problem that I don't like so much. And that is that we're starting to have all these strings here for query selectors all over the place. Like this one, this one, this one, and down here is also this one. And they are only going to get more as we proceed with our application. And that's a problem because imagine that we make some changes in the UI and the class names, and then we would have to change all of these strings manually. And this, of course, could cause some serious bugs. So instead, we can simply create an object where we store all of this data. And since we're talking about the UI here, we should of course do it in the UI controller. So we can create a private variable here and call it DOM strings. So DOM strings. And it's going to be an object, and I will store all of the strings in here. So let's say input type, and then I put this one here. And now I could go ahead and simply write DOM strings dot input type. Alright, so now if I decide to change all of the class names in the entire user interface, then it's not such a big problem. Then I just have to come here and change the string in here as well, and not in our entire code. So this means that we have now a central place where all the strings are nicely stored, and we can then retrieve them and change them easily. So once again, programming is not just to make things work in some way, but it's also create the necessary structures to make our life easier. And this is definitely one of these moments where we have to create some kind of data structure to make it easier for us later on. Okay, so input description. And of course, it's going to be this one. And then the input value. And now I just need to put them back here. So DOM strings, and this was the input description. So input description, and then here the DOM strings dot input value. So just to confirm, let's reload this and see if it still works. So test 78, and yep, so it still works. All right, so now there's only one place left where we have a hard-coded string, which is in here. Now the DOM strings object is in a different controller, right? So we don't really have access to it from here. So is the solution just to copy this object here into our controller? No, of course not, and you already know that by now, right? So the best solution is, of course, to pass this object from one controller, from one module to the other. So what I'm going to do is something similar to the getInput method here, and this one will simply be called get the DOM strings. And all we need in this function, in this method here, is to return our private DOM strings into the public. So basically we're now exposing the DOM strings object into the public. So I can now come down here into our controller and define a new variable to get the DOM strings. So UI controller dot get DOM strings. And that's it. So now inside of this DOM variable, we also have the DOM strings that we have up here in this controller. Because once again, we expose them to the public by using this method here, okay? So now, what I can do is, of course, I first need to add this to the DOM strings, right? So I say input button. Okay, and so now I can use it here. So DOM dot input button, because remember now it's called DOM here because that's the variable where it's stored now and no longer DOM strings. So in this controller it's called DOM. So let's test this again very quickly. So again, test, then let's say 55 here. And now I hit this button, and yes, so down here it is. So we're making some great progress here in our application, and we're getting a really nice structure here, which is something really important, as you know by now. And so in the next lecture, let's continue with that. So see you then. In order to make our app structure even a little bit better, let's now create an init function such as we did with our pig game project before. So in this lecture, you're going to learn how and why we should create an initialization function in our current architecture. So here is our controller again, and I feel like things are all a bit scattered here in the controller, like these event listeners here are just hanging around here, and then up here we have this variable declaration. And so I think we should organize this a bit and make it so that we only have functions here in the controller. So let's create a function here called setup event listeners. Okay, so a function in which all our event listeners will be placed. Because right now we have 2, but over the course of this project we will probably add some more. So let's do that. So setup event listeners. So function, and we don't need any parameters. And so I'm just going to copy these event listeners right here into our function. We don't need this extra space here. Okay, so here I left out a semicolon. And now this can go. And also into our function should of course go this here, right? Because we'll only need these DOM elements here for our event listeners. Okay, so now we have a function that sets up all our event listeners, and we have a function that gets called when we want to add a new item. And these are both private functions, right? They're not exposed to the public. Now, if we want these event listeners here to be added or to be set up, then these lines of code here, of course, need to run, right? Which means that this function, this setup event listener function, has to be called somehow. And up until this point, this wasn't a problem because all of this was here in this iffy, so in this immediately evoked function expression, meaning that we didn't have to think about if this code is executed or not, because it's automatically executed, right? But now we need to call this function. And the best and most common way to do this is to create a public initialization function, which we're going to call init. So let's now do that. So since we want it to be public, we need to return it in an object, right? And we simply call it init. All right. So in this function, we can, for example, say that the application has started with a simple console log, just to test this. And then we need to call our setup event listeners function, which was why we created this init function in the first place, right? So setup event listeners. Okay, so that's it for now. This init function will be useful for other things in the future, so that's also a reason why we created this. But for now, this is enough here. So this means that our event listeners are only going to be set up as soon as we call the init function. So we need to do that, and we do that outside of the controllers. So this will be the only line of code that's going to be placed on the outside. So controller.init. And without this line of code, nothing is ever going to happen. And that's because there will be no event listeners, right? And without event listeners, we cannot input data, and without data, there is no application. So let's check out if this works. All right, so application has started. Let's see if this still works. Yes, so we still see our object here, which we still print to the console. And we can actually now go ahead and delete that console.log, if I could find it at least. Here it is. Okay, so yeah, this is our init function. We created it because we want to have a place where we can put all the code that we want to be executed right at the beginning when our application starts. And right now, that is to set up the event listeners, but there will be more code in the future. So more things that we have to do right at the start of our app. Alright, that's it for this lecture. So let's now move on and create some function constructors. In this lecture, we're going to think together about how we want to store our income and expense data in the budget controller. So in this lecture, you'll learn how to choose function constructors that meet our application needs and how to set up a proper data structure for our budget controller. So let's go to our budget controller up here, which is still empty at this point. Okay, so we need a data model for expenses and incomes here. So we know that each new item will have a description and a value, right? And we also know that we should probably have some way to distinguish between different incomes or expenses. And so basically we want them to have a unique ID number as well. Now, how would you store this kind of data? I know that I would choose an object. That sounds like the best choice. So an object that simply has a description, a value, and an ID. Now, what do we do when we want to create lots of objects? Yes, we create function constructors, which we can then use to instantiate lots of objects, lots of expense and income objects. And like that, we basically create a custom data type for incomes and one for expenses. So let's do that. So I'm going to start with the expense. So expense, and you already know that for a function constructor, we usually use the capital letter here in the beginning so that we can distinguish them from the other functions. So function, and now we pass the data into it that we want them to have. So again, they should have an ID, a description, and a value. And I hope that you remember how we actually write these function constructors, right? So it goes like this. We say this.id should be equal to the ID that we pass in. And the same for the others. So description should be the description that we pass in. And then the value. So this.value should be the value that we pass into our function constructor. And that's it actually. So again, we choose to create objects here through the expense function constructor because there will be lots of expenses. And therefore this is the best way to do this. Okay, so that's the expense. Now I also need this for the income. And actually it will be exactly the same for now. So I will just copy it and then change it here to income. It cannot be the exact same though, because later in the project I will have to add more things into the expense, so the expense will be different from the income. So we have to keep them separate. Now in case that we need some methods for them, we can of course put these methods in a prototype property of the expense or of the income for function constructors here, like we did before. So that all objects created through them will inherit these methods. So instead of writing these methods right into the constructors, we can put them into the prototypes. And we already learned that before, right? So this is better because in this way, they are not attached to each individual object, but instead each object will then inherit it from the prototype. So yeah, exactly like we learned before. But for now, let's leave it like this because we don't have any method here for now. Okay, so these are now private functions here in the budget controller module, but let me just take this one and copy it here to the outside just so that we can experiment with it in the console, okay? So just like this, and I will delete it after, okay? So let's just go here and refresh this page. And then we hopefully have the expense here, let's see. So yes, this is our function constructor. So let's now create a new object using this, okay? So let's say var exp, and remember we now have to use the new keyword. And why is that? Do you remember? It's because this new keyword creates a new empty object and then calls the expense function and points to this keyword of that function to the new object that was created. So when we then set properties on the this keyword, we automatically set them on the new object that was created here. And that's why function constructors work. Alright, so I'm sure you remember this from the lectures that we had before, so I just wanted to remind you of that. And of course you can always go back to that if you feel like it. Alright, so the ID, let's say, is 1. The description can be again test, and let's say 100. Alright, and if we now see the expense object, it is indeed as we wanted it to be. So description, ID and value, and then the prototype is of course the object. And here we see that this is an expense object now, because it was created through the expense function constructor. Okay, so this function constructor works as expected. So I don't need this anymore here, because I really just want them to be private in here. So that's it about function constructors. Let's now think about the data structure of this budget controller itself. And remember, the budget controller keeps track of all the incomes and expenses, and also of the budget itself, and later also the percentages. And so we need a good data structure for that. So imagine that the user would input 10 incomes. So we would create 10 income objects, right? So where would you store all of these 10 incomes? I think that the best solution is to store these into an array. Very simple. So we could go ahead and create something like this. So var all expenses, and then an empty array where we are then going to store all of these. And then we could do the same thing for the incomes, right? So incomes. And then we could also say var total expenses equal 0, for example, and do the same thing for the income and for the budget and so on and so forth. Now, this is maybe not the best solution, right? Because think about this. Each time that we can somehow aggregate a lot of information into one nice data structure, we should definitely do that. It's always better to have one data structure where all of our data goes, instead of having a lot of like random variables floating around, okay? So let's do that. Let's create one big structure for everything. And I'm simply going to call this one data, okay? So var data will be simply an object where I'm going to put all of this data. So what do you think of doing it like this? So I'm just going to copy this. And turn it into properties of this object, right? So what do you think of this? We can still do a little bit better, right? Because both of these are arrays which store all instances of either expenses or incomes. So what we can do here is to simply write all items, and then all items is also an object. And now we say expenses is an empty array and incomes is also an empty array. And this is better. Here, of course, it's a comma. And now the same thing for the total expenses. So instead of writing total expenses and total incomes, we can say totals simply. And then let it be an object. And then 0 for the expenses and 0 for the incomes. And we're going to use this one later. And we're later also going to add more things in here. But for now, that's enough to show you how and why we should create a data structure like this. And this will make even more sense as we progress with the project. Okay, so now we have everything set up here in our budget controller, so that in the next lecture we can actually create a new item here when someone inputs a new income or an expense into our user interface. So we have our constructors and we have this data structure here ready to receive data, so we can now move on. Let's now finally use the user input data to create a new item in our budget controller data structure. And by doing that, we'll learn how to avoid conflicts in our data structure and also how and why to pass data from one module to another. And we actually already did that, but in this lecture, it will make even more sense. So let's now create a public method right here in the budget controller that's gonna allow other modules to add a new item into our data structure. So we return an object once again, which is gonna contain all of our public methods, which for now is only this one, add item. So a function with some arguments that I'm going to specify right now, and then our function body. So if someone calls this method, what do they have to tell us in order that we can create a new item? First, we would have to know the type. So if it's an income or an expense. So type, and we also need the description, right? And of course, the value of the income or of the expense. And I'm using different names here so that we have less confusion. So in this method, they have their own names. So type, des, and vol. Alright, so how would we add, for example, a new expense? We would simply do it like this. New expense, and then we need an ID. We would pass the designation and the value, right? And then we would also store this, of course, in a new variable. So let's call that one new item. And I'm going to declare it up here in the beginning of the method. So var new item. Okay. So this is in the case that we're talking about an expense. So the input here can be an expense or an income. But what exactly are we going to receive here in this type argument? For that, let's take a look at the controller again. Okay. So the input that we're going to receive here, this input variable, which will come from the UI controller, will actually contain this type, right? So let's go check out this method. So it's here, right? So one of them will be the type. And this is the type that we're later going to pass into our addItem method. And remember, we wrote down here that it will be either inc for income or exp for expense. Okay, and since we know that this is the data that will be passed into the addItem method, we know that we can expect either inc or exp. So we can now use this knowledge here in this function. So we can say that if the type is an exp, so an expense, then this is what we're going to do. So the new item will be a new expense. So I was missing the equal operator here, right? But if it's not an exp, so if it's an income, so an inc, then what we want is, of course, to create an income object. Okay, so again, if we receive this string here as the type argument, then we want to create a new expense using the designation and the value that we pass in. Or if the type is an income, then we want to create a new income object based on the income function constructor that we have, remember, up here also in this budget controller, right? And so this is how we create our new items. Now there's of course one missing piece, which is this ID, but let's leave this one for later. So for now, let me just say that ID is 0. And I'm going to change that later again. But for now, let's leave it like this. And so after we have the new item, we can then add it to our data structure. So remember, all of these new items will be stored in this data object, and inside this data object, in the all items object. And in there we have two arrays called exp and inc. And now see that these names are the exact same names that we have here. So exp and inc, which is what we receive here from the type. So this is very, very useful because now we can simply do it like this. So data dot all items, and now we don't need any if or else statement to determine in which of the arrays we want to store the data. No, we can just do it like this. Type, right? And if we now say push, and I'm sure that you remember this method, we can add our new item at the end of the array. And that's it. So let's think about this again. So we have the type that is exp or inc, which comes from here. And these two designations are the exact same that we have here in our data structure. And therefore we can use these brackets here to select the array that we want here from our all items object. So if it's exp for an expense, then this array here will be selected from the all items object. And if it's inc, then of course this array here will be selected. And then we can use the push method on it. And the push method, remember, simply adds a new element at the end of the array. Okay, so this is very simple. And now all we need to do is to return that new item as well. Because then the other module or the other function that's going to call this one can have direct access to the item that we just create. And this will be useful as you will see in a second. Now there's one thing that we left for the end, remember, and that's this ID part here. And this ID is a little bit tricky. So remember, the ID is a unique number that we want to assign to each new item that we put either in the expense or in the income arrays for the all items, right? So how can we determine, how can we specify this ID for each new item? The first thing that comes in mind would be to simply use the length of the already existing array and then add 1, right? So imagine that we had an array with 5 elements. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it would sound logical to say, okay, the next one should have an ID of 6, right? So the next ID equals 6. So this is just a comment just to show it to you. So this would be the simplest solution. Now there's a big problem with this, and that's because later on we're going to delete items from this. And so imagine that instead of this nicely sorted array here, we would have IDs like this. So for example, 1, 2, 4, 6, and 8. Something like this. If we would now go ahead and say that the next ID should be 6, then the problem would be that we would have 2 elements with ID of 6. So this is not ideal at all, right? Because each ID should only exist once. So in this case, what should the next ID be? It should be 9, right? So next ID should be 9, because that's the number that comes after the last one. So let's describe what we want and then code it. So we want the ID to be equal last ID plus 1. And how do we determine the last ID? In this case here, the last ID would be the position number 4, right? Because 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And why is it 4? It's 4 because the length is 5, and since the array is 0 based, the last one is 5 minus 1. So based on that, let's do this. So we want to first select the last element. So data.allItems, and then of the type that we're currently using, right? And I already explained that down here, why this works this way, right? And now we want the last one. And the last one is simply the length minus 1. So again, data.allItems type length minus 1. Okay, so this looks a bit strange, right? So imagine that the type would be inc. So in this case, this would be data.allItems inc. So this one here. So we want to now select the last item. So we need this here, the brackets, with a number in it so that we can select the last element. And the number is, as I explained before, the length of the array minus 1. And so we need to type all of this again and then retrieve the length and then minus 1. Okay, so now we have the very last item, but we only want the ID, right? So we retrieve the ID like this. Okay, so this is basically the last ID. So if our array would be this one, then our last ID would now be 8. And remember, the ID that we want is 9, so last ID plus 1. So this is the last ID plus 1. And here we have the ID for a new item. So this is actually already it. So let's just comment this. So create new ID, then we create the new item based on inc or exp type, then push it into our data structure, and finally return the new element. And I actually highly encourage you to do this kind of comments whenever you can, so that later your code becomes more easily for you to understand when you didn't look at it for some time. Alright, so now this method is ready to be used. So let's do that in a controller, of course. Where else could it be, right? And we're going to do that right here in the control add function. So we already have our input. So we can now use that input to add the new item. And for that we call the add item method on the budget controller. So budget controller add item. And now let's remember the data structure that we returned from the get input method here. So it was type, description, and value. So an object with these three properties. So this input variable here right now has that object. So we now say input.type, then input.description, and input.value. Make sense? So our add item method accepts three parameters, so three arguments, which are the type, description, and value. And so in here we pass the three, which come right from our input that we get from our user interface here with this method. And now remember that this add item method returns an object, so we have to save it here. So let's call it new item here as well. So var new item. And let's actually also declare all the variables here at the top. So var input and new item. All right. So this should now be working just fine. And remember that this will not be yet displayed on the user interface, of course, but it should appear in our data structure. Now the data structure is a private variable in our module, right? So this data structure here is not visible. So when we add now something, then it will be here in our data structure, but it will not be accessible from the outside. So let's just quickly add a new method here, just so we can see it in the console, okay? So this method is going to be testing. Again, this is not for us to use in the application, but just to test this in the console, okay? So function, and all this does is to console.log our data structure, okay? And now we're ready to test this. All right, so let's add an an expense, like new car for $1,500 and hit OK. And all right, so we have a bug here on line 37. So let's check that one out. So line 37 again, and it's here in this line where we create the new ID. And let's go back. It says that it cannot read a property ID of undefined. Okay, and that makes a lot of sense because right now we don't have any item here in our data structure here, okay? So of course, here this length will be 0, and then 0 minus 1 is minus 1, and there's obviously no minus 1 in this array. And so this ID cannot exist because there is no item in the array for that. So what we have to do here is that when the array is empty, then the new ID should be 0. Okay, so let's do that. So if data.allItems, and then the array with our type again. So the length of this should be greater than 0. And only in this case this will happen. Okay? And if not, then the ID should be 0. Okay? So this is for the beginning. So right now, the all items array of both income and expense both have a length of 0. So the ID will always be 0 now. But then as soon as we have some element, then the new ID will be defined based on this. So let's see if it works now. And again, an expense for a new car for 1500. And all right. So nothing happened because we didn't write a method yet for displaying this in the user interface. But let's now use our testing method. So testing, and okay. So this is our data structure. And it has, of course, the all items object and the totals object. So exactly what we put in the data structure in the budget controller. All right, and here's the expense array. And there are actually already two. So I clicked twice on this button here. And here's our expense, the one that we created with the expense function constructor. So new car 1500 and the ID is 0. And let's see, the other expense is also new car 1500, but the ID is 1. Okay, so this was because I clicked twice here on the button. So we created two expenses. But what this shows us is that this is really working. So let's just add an income as well. So project, doesn't really matter, for 2000. Hit enter. And then let's use this again. So the totals there are of course still 0 because we don't have any code for this as yet. But now the income also has one element. And it's this income that we just added. So project with a value of 2000 and an ID of 0. And of course, our two expenses are also still here. So this is really working now. So all we need to do now is to actually add this new element into the user interface. So let's now do that in the next lecture. In this lecture, it's finally time to add our newly created object to the user interface. And this means that we're going to do some DOM manipulation for the first time in this project. And this means that you're going to learn a technique for adding big chunks of HTML into the DOM, how to replace parts of strings, and also how to do DOM manipulation using the insert adjacent HTML method. So it's time to go back to our user interface controller and add a new public method here, right? And I'm going to put it right here. And this one is going to be called add a list item. So add list item. So a function, as always, and a function body. And what kind of information do we need to add this new item to the list? First, we need the object itself. So let's call it object, and then the type. So if it's an income or an expense, so we already know that. So and this object is the exact same object that we created using the function constructor and then passed to our app controller in the last lecture. So let's quickly review that. So down here in the control add item function, which remember is the function that is called when someone hits the input button or hits the enter key, then we first read the input out of the fields, store it into the input variable, then using this input variable and the add item method, we create a new item and we return it and store it in this variable. So in here, in the new item variable, we now have the new object. And that's the object that we're going to pass to our add list item method. Does that make sense to you? So again, the logic here is that this method here, or this function, is like the control center of the application. So it tells the other modules what it should do, and it then gets data back that it can then use in other things, such as this input variable, for example, and this new item variable that we will use to display the object on the interface. So let's go back to the add list item method. So what are we going to do here? So this will be in 3 steps. So the first thing is to create an HTML string with some placeholder text. So create HTML string with placeholder text. And then we're going to replace the placeholder text with some actual data, which is the data that we receive from the object. And then finally, we insert the HTML into the DOM. Make sense? So let's talk about the first part, which is creating the HTML string. And for that, we need to look at our HTML file. Okay, so in here, this is how an income item looks like. So we have the description here, right? So salary in this case, then the value, which would be 2100 here. Then we also have a delete button. Okay, so this is the HTML for an income. And then down here, we have the expense, which actually looks pretty similar. The only difference is that we have the item percentage class here, which we're going to talk about later. So this is one of the differences, and the other difference is that the ID for the expenses is expense 0, expense 1, and so on and so forth. And then here it's income 0, income 1, income 2, and so on and so forth. So we actually need to create different HTML strings for incomes and for expenses. So let's start with the incomes, and I will just copy all of this and paste it here into our JavaScript. Okay. All right. So this looks a bit weird now, because the JavaScript file is of course not to write HTML. So what we're going to do now is to put this in our single quotes like this. And now all we need to do is to remove all of these spaces here. Okay. So this is a bit boring work, but we'll have to do it. Okay. Alright, so now this is a string which contains a lot of HTML. And actually this is a good place to show you the difference between the single quotes, this one's here, and the double quotes. So inside of these single quotes, we have lots of double quotes in here. So all of these, as you see here, all of these are double quotes. And so JavaScript doesn't interpret this as an end of the string, because we began the string with a single quote, and so the end of the string is a single quote as well. Now if we have put the double quotes here like this, then JavaScript would only interpret this as a string here, because then it would be the beginning of the string and here the end. And then here a new beginning and here a new end. But that's of course not what we want. So we want a single quote here. Now if all of these would be single quotes in here and not double quotes, then in the outside we would put double quotes, and then it would work as well. Alright, so let's call this one HTML. And I'm going to declare it up here. Okay, so this is the one for income. And the one for outcome will actually be pretty similar. So let's get this one as well. So this is like a template that we copy here into the JavaScript file so that we can then use it. So once again, removing all of these white spaces here. And here we go. So now put the quotes around this. And here we go. And now what I need to do is actually to create an if-else statement because of the type. So if the type is an income, so inc, then we want this to be the HTML string. Okay. And else, if the type is exp, so for expense, then it should be this HTML string. Alright, and now what we want to do is to replace the actual data that is in here with some placeholder. And that's because when we then receive our object here, right, we can then go ahead and replace these placeholders with the actual data. So let's do that. So let's replace this with something like this. So percentage ID percentage. And I use these percentage symbols here so that the placeholder text is easier to find here and that we don't override something that we don't want, okay? So in here, it's gonna be a value, right? So value. And I'm missing the description. Ah, here it is, okay. So description. And of course the same thing in here. So this is where the ID will go. This is the description. And then here, the value. All right, cool. So let's now go to the next step, which is to replace the placeholder with the actual data. And in order to do that, we will use a brand new method that we have never used before, which is the replace method. So let's say I will create a new variable first, new HTML, okay? So let's say new HTML is HTML, which is our string, and then strings have a bunch of their own methods, just like array. And since HTML is a string, we can use all the strings methods here. So we use the replace method. And what replace does is exactly what we want. It searches for a string and then replaces that string with the data that we put into the method. So let's start with the ID here. So our placeholder text goes like this, ID, and what we want to replace it with is our object dot ID. Okay? Because remember, the ID property is the one that holds, of course, the ID. And we can see that here. Okay? So these are our function constructors, and they are called ID, description, and value. So these are the three that we will have here in our addList method, and that we can use to replace our placeholder strings. So this was the first replacement. And now we can overwrite this new variable that we created. And now we will not replace the placeholder in HTML again, because it's in the new HTML variable now where we have made this replacement here. So if we would now do HTML replace again, then this ID placeholder here would still be there. Okay, so we actually need to do it on a new HTML. Replace. And let's go with the description now. And say object.description. And now I'm just going to duplicate this. So here is value, and here is value as well. Alright, and now all we need to do is to insert this into the DOM. And that's something new that we didn't do before, so let's see how we can do that. So we first need to select some element on our web page, so from the DOM, and then we can insert our HTML next to that. And we're going to use the insert adjacent HTML method for that. So let's take a look at the reference page of that element, and it's right here. So this insert adjacent HTML method first accepts the position and then the text, so the string, the HTML that we want to insert. And there are 4 different positions in which we can insert the HTML. So imagine that this P element was the one that we selected. We can then insert before that element even begins, so we use before begin. We can insert it as a sibling after that, so after end, or we can insert it as a child of P. And then we have 2 options, which is after begin, which is basically before any content inside of the P element, so after the P element began, and then before the end, so at the end of the P element, but after all of the content that is inside of it. And that one is actually the one that we're going to use. So we're going to use before and I will show you why that is. So let's go back to our HTML file. And what we're going to do is to add the expenses into this expense list container. And in there will be a lot of child elements. So all of these expenses will be childs of the expense list container. So that's for expenses. And for incomes, it's called the income list. So in this case, the div element here has a class of income list. So we actually need these 2 and then decide which one we want to append this new HTML. So let's start with the income list. And maybe you can guess what we're going to do now. We will put a new field, a new property here in our DOM strings, okay? And I'm going to call it the income container. Income container. And then I will paste it here. Oh, sorry, I didn't copy it. So income list. Okay. And then I'm going to duplicate this line and do the same for the expenses. So expenses container will be the expenses list. So again, this is the element that we want to select if we have an income, and this is the element that we want to select if we have an expense. So let's do that here in our add list item method. So we can use this if else statement for that, right? So if it's an income, we can say that the element should be DOM strings dot income container. All right, and I still have to declare it here. So element. And now in case that it's an expense, then the element will be DOM strings dot expenses container. All right, and now we're ready to select this. So document dot query selector, and now we simply select the element. Okay, so very easy. This element will be the income list if it's an income, and the expense list if it's an expense. All right, and now it's time to use our insert adjacent HTML method. All right, and as we said, we're going to use before and. So before and then what we want to insert there is of course our HTML. So the string that we produced, and actually it's not HTML, it is new HTML, because that's the one that already has all our values, description and ID. So again, this before and keyword here makes it so that all of our HTML will be inserted as a child of these containers, so this income list and the expense list, but as the last child, so as the last element in the list. So if you already had like 2 or 3 items here, then the next one would be here after that, so the last one. Let's just look again at the reference. So imagine if we would use before begin. Then the new element would be inserted right here. So before this income list. So not as a child, but as a sibling and before this element. And then after the end would be down here. So also as a sibling, but after this element. Okay, but enough code. Let's now see if this actually works. So again, we need to reload this. Okay. Application has started. So everything seems to work up until this point. So I'm now going to add an income. Let's say project for 1,500 euros. And nothing happened. And that makes a lot of sense, of course, because nowhere in our code we called this addListItem method, right? So before making it possible to anything appear here, of course, we need to first call this. So we do this, of course, in our control addItem function. So it's as simple as this. The UI controller addListItem. And now, as I said in the beginning, what we're going to pass in here is the new item that was created here before. Okay? So the object created through one of our function constructors. So the new item and then the type. So we're going to use input.type, right? Because that's where our type is stored. So whether it's an income or an expense. And now it should be ready to work. So again, project 1,500. Oh yeah, here it is. So it worked. It is here in our user interface. How cool is that, right? So it really worked. This is really cool. So let's try it with another one. Let's say we sold our car for 2,500. And yeah, here it is also. So for me, this is a really magical moment when we hit the enter button here and then something like magic appears here on a web page. So this is really cool. Let's try out an expense now. Let's say our rent is like, I don't know, $950. And now it should appear in expenses, right? And yes, here it goes. So everything works exactly as expected. Now forget about this 21% here, because this is just the text that we copied from our HTML page, and we're going to take care of this later. But for now, what matters here is that at this point we're able to really add the elements to our user interface. So this is already a great achievement. So now that we have this, over the next lectures we're going to take care here of the budget part. So we're going to calculate the budget and update it here on the user interface as well. So don't wait and join me right in the next lecture. So in the last lecture I promised you that we were going to work on the budget calculation now, but first we need to actually fix a really annoying thing in our user interface, which is to clear the input fields after we entered an input. And in this lecture you're going to learn a lot of new stuff. So you'll learn how to clear HTML fields, how to use query selector all that we hadn't used before. You'll learn how to convert a list to an array, and also a better way to loop over an array than for loops. And that is the for each method. So a lot of stuff to cover in this lecture, so let's do it. So here is the problem that we need to solve. So in the last lecture we added this rent here, but now this rent and the value as well is still here. So we can continue to click here and the new one will be added. And if we continue to click, new ones will be added. So all of these rents are now here. So of course we need a way to clear these input fields, right? So let's now do that. And since this has clearly to do with the user interface, we go to our UI controller, which is right here. So we're going to add a new method to this controller. And of course it's going to be a public method once again. And this one is called clear fields. So clear fields. And of course, we don't need any parameters because we already know which are the fields that we're going to clear, which are the two that we saw before. All right, so these are two fields. So let's now use the query selector all instead of doing the query selector that we've been using. So we could do that, then we would use it twice, but instead we can reduce it to one line of code by using the query selector all. So let's do that. So document.query selector, and this time it's the query selector all. So let's check out which one we need. So it will be the input description here and the input value, right? So we need to select these two. So DOM strings dot input description here. Okay, and now remember, the syntax here is like CSS selecting. So we separate different selectors simply with a comma. So we need a string with a comma here, and then we can join these strings together, right? So what is left now is the input value. Input value. Okay, and let's actually store this in a variable. Okay, so I'm going to call it fields. So fields, because these are our two fields, right? And let's declare the variable once again here in the top. So var fields. Okay, so this fields variable now holds the result of this selection. Now the problem is that the query selector all method does return something strange. It doesn't return a nice array which we can then use and loop over, but instead it returns something similar but still different, and that's a list. So again, a list is a bit similar to an array, but it doesn't have all of these nice methods that we have for arrays. So the solution to that is to convert the list to an array. And there's actually a nice little trick that we can use for that. And the trick is to use the array method called slice. And what slice does is to return a copy of the array that it's called on. So usually we call this method on an array and it then returns another array. But we can kind of trick this method and pass a list into it, and then it will still return an array. So that's the solution for this. Alright, but there's only one small problem with that, because we cannot do it like this. So fields.slice will not work, because again it's not an array, and so we cannot call array methods here on the list. Instead, what we have to do is to call the slice methods using the call method, and then passing the fields variable into it so that it becomes the this variable, and then it's gonna work just fine. And how can we do that? So where is the slice method actually stored that we can use it? Let's think about that. So where do you think it is stored? And the solution is that it's in the array prototype. So we can write something like this. So this array is the function constructor for all arrays, right? And we know that all the methods that the arrays inherit from the array function constructors are in the array's prototype property, right? And therefore we know that the slice method must also be there. So we can write array.prototype and then .slice. Alright, so here it is. And since this is a function, we can then use the call method on it, right? So call. And then in here, we set the this variable to the fields. And this will trick the slice method into thinking that we give it an array, and so it will return an array. So if we now store this into a variable and call it a fields array, then this will be an array. And actually, again, I'm putting it up here. So fields array. So this is now an array. So this is a nice little trick that we can use. This means that we can now loop over this array and clear all the fields that were selected. which were only 2 in this case, but if it would be more, then all of the fields could be cleared at once. Now we could do it with the old school for loop that we have been using all the time up until this point, right? But let's make it more exciting, and so I will show you a new method that we can use on arrays, which is the for each method. It works something like this. So fields array, and now for each. And this is really simple. All we have to do is to pass a callback function into this method, and then this callback function is applied to each of the elements in the array. So let's put an anonymous function in here. Okay. Just like this. Now this callback function here, so this anonymous function in this case here, can receive up to 3 arguments. And this is really like the callback function that we saw before on the event listener. Remember that? In that case, we did automatically have access to the event object. And we could name that object as we wanted, right? So here it's actually pretty similar. So here we have access to 3 things. We have access to the current value. So this means the value of the array that is currently being processed, let's say. Then we also have the index number. So the number going from 0 to the length of the array -1. And then also the entire array. So we have access to the entire array here as well. And again, we can name this as we want. We could just call these something like cur, let's say. And this one just index or just I. So we can do it as we want, and it will always work. So this is something really nice that JavaScript has for some methods. So remember, what we want to do here is to simply clear all these fields. So we want to see them empty. And that's actually really simple. So all we have to do is to select the current, okay, which is this here. And this means the current element that is being processed. So it will first be the input description and then the input value, right? So if we set the value of these back to empty, then the fields will simply be cleared. And it really is as simple as this. So again, this for each method here loops over all of the elements of the fields array and then sets the value of all of them back to the empty string. And we have access to the current element thanks to this callback function here, which has access to these 3 arguments. So the current element, the current index, and the original array, which in this case would be fields array. Okay? So let's now use this method. And for that, we're going to go back to our controller. And this is something that we actually didn't put here in our comments. So let's say for clear the fields. And what we're going to do is UI controller and clear fields. So as simple as that. So let's now test this. So reload. And now salary, let's say, of 1200. And yeah, the fields are empty now. Let's try it again. So holidays, 600. And yeah, it's empty again. Now, one thing that we should also do is to set the focus back to the first field here, right? So that we can easily continue to put more items in here. And that's also pretty easy to do. So let's just go back to our clear fields method. And then we just need a line of code here, which sets the focus on the first element of the array, right? So fields array 0, which is the first element, which will be the input description, which is exactly what we want. So it will select the first element, and then we simply need to use the focus method. So focus, and that's it. All right, let's see that again. And again, salary, 1200, let's say. And yeah, the focus is back to the description. So this makes it easier to input the values. Alright, but now it's really time to start working here on the budget and on the total income and expenses. So, come with me right to the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to start working on updating the budget, and the first step is to look at our controller module. We'll also fix some minor problems that our app still has at this point. And so you'll learn how to convert field inputs to numbers, and you'll also learn how to prevent false inputs. Alright, so here in our controller module, and more specifically here in the control add item function, we already have these spots here to call the methods that are going to handle the budget update. Now I want to move this to a separate function, and that's because first, these steps kind of belong together, and second, because we're going to do all of this again later when we want to delete an item. So instead of repeating this code by then, we can simply write a new function to keep the dry principle, so the don't repeat yourself principle. And so I'm going to do that right now. And I'm going to call it update budget. So very simple. So var update budget. And we don't need any parameters. So all of this will actually go in here. So first we calculate the budget, which we're going to do in the next lecture in the budget controller. And then we're also going to have a method that will then return the budget. Okay, and I'm doing two separate functions here. So one that calculates the budget, and one that simply returns the budget and does nothing else. And that's because I want you to get used to this kind of philosophy that each function has a specific task, and that simply getting some information from a module is a good task for a simple function. And we actually have already done some of these get functions like get input or get DOM strings, and so we're going to continue with that here. So we will have another function in the budget controller that will simply return the budget. And then of course we need to display the budget on the user interface, and that will be a method on the UI controller that we're also going to code not in the next lecture but in the one after that. Okay, so then we have to of course call this function in here, right? So let me just say calculate and update budget, and then we call update budget. Alright, so in here we set the stage. Now we just need to code all of these methods over the next lectures, and I will then call them from the update budget function. Now, before we can move on to actually do all of these calculations, there are still two things left that we have to take care of. And in order to see them, let's look again at our project here. And the first one is this. So let's suppose we add something here. Let's say salary again, and then 1200. Okay, so everything nice here. So let's use the test method that we did for the budget controller. Remember that? So we had budget controller and then a testing method, which was only to display the internal data structure where all the incomes and expenses are stored. So here's the object, if I remember, is called data, and it has these two objects in it. So here we have the income that we just added, right? So this array, actually this object, so the description is salary and the value is 1200 and the ID is 0. Now here is the problem. We see here that this value is not really a number, it's actually a string, right? And that is a problem. So the ID here is a number, so everything's fine here, but this is a string and we cannot do calculations with strings. So we need to change this. So remember where we actually read this data from the interface? There's a method up here, and here it is. It's the get input method, right? So here in this line of code, we read this value. And what we read is a string, as we just saw, and not a number. But fortunately, there's a very handy function in JavaScript, which is simply called parseFloat. So parse float, which converts a string to a floating number. So basically a decimal number, a number with decimals. And so we can have numbers with decimals. So instead of having $10, we can have $10.50, for example. All right, so again, this function is going to take this string here that this returns and convert it to a number, which is then assigned to this value property. So let's now reload this and check if that actually worked. So salary once again, 1200. And then we need to use our testing method again. And now you see why it's so useful to simply write a testing method like this, not to use in production, so not to use in the final application, but here during development, it's really useful to have a public method like this to expose some internal data. So all items again, the income, and all right, here we go. You see, now it's a number, so it no longer has the quotes, and it's also here printed blue, like the 0, right? So now it's a number, and now we can use it to make calculations. And so we solved one of the two problems. So let's see the second problem, and to show it to you, all I have to do is to keep clicking on this button. So, do you see what's happening here? We are simply adding empty lines without anything in them. And that's because we don't have any test. We don't have anything in our code that says that we actually need to have some data here and some values here, right? And so this is another thing that we really need to take care of before we can move on. So let's do that now. And the best place to do this is in the function in our controller where we say what to do when the user hits the button. Okay, so let's come back down here. And this is the control add item function, right? So what we can do here is to say that we only want all of this here to happen if there actually is some data that we can use. So we can, of course, use an if statement for that, right? So let's put it right here. Okay. And what do we want here? First, we want the description to not be empty, right? So let's say input.description should be different from the empty string. Okay, so this will prevent that there are some inputs where there's no description at all. Now we also want the same thing with numbers, right? So there's a function in JavaScript which tests if a number is not a number. So this sounds a bit confusing, so let's go back here to the interface. Okay, so in JavaScript there's something, this NaN, and this means not a number. And so as we hit this input button here, without any number here, this then returned not a number, okay? And so what we want is that this is not a number. Make sense? So right now it's not a number. So what we want is the other thing. So we want it not to be not a number, so that it's a number. So what we can do is to test if it's not a number, like this, is not a number, and then we pass the input dot value. Okay. Now, if this is not a number, it will return true.